Hello everyone, this is Khalifa Khalid and in this video we'll be going over the CBR lecture Ethical Issues in Medical Research. This lecture is basically answering one big question. How do we make sure research on humans is done safely, fairly and morally? To start, we must look at the past to know why research ethics exists in the first place. Whether it was injecting live cancer cells into elderly patients or exposing mentally retarded children to infectious hepatitis, there are many examples of unethical studies. The lecture focuses on some examples, starting with the Nuremberg trials. After World War II, the Allied forces set up courts in Nuremberg, Germany to prosecute Nazi doctors who conducted horrific experiments on prisoners. The judges realized that there were no clear international rules about how to ethically conduct medical research on humans. So, in 1947, they created the Nuremberg Code. The code includes 10 principles. First and most important is that voluntary human consent is essential. Experimental results should result in good for the society. Anticipated results should justify the experiment, meaning that the potential benefit must outweigh the risks. Avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering. If there is a chance of death or disability, there is no experiment. What about chemotherapy trials, you might ask? This goes back to point 3. Advanced cancer is almost certainly deadly, so a risky experiment is justified. Then, minimize risk of subjects. Have a safe environment for subjects. Experiments are conducted by qualified persons. Subjects can withdraw at any time. Finally, stop once you have your answer. After the Nuremberg Code, doctors realized that the code was good, but it was too strict and not practical enough. So, the Declaration of Helsinki was made to be written by doctors for doctors. What's most important is the October 2024 revision, which had 3 changes. First, we no longer say subjects, we say participants. Second, instead of excluding vulnerable populations, we actually better protect them by including them safely. If we never study pregnant women, children, etc., we have no evidence on how to treat them. Lastly, there is more emphasis on scientific rigor and community engagement. Between 1932 and 1972, Alabama, researchers conducted a study on the natural progression of untreated syphilis, which is known as the Tuskegee study. The participants were poor and rural African American men, and they were told they were receiving medical care. But, in reality, the researchers did not treat them. Even after penicillin became the standard cure in the 1940s, the doctors still withheld treatment for decades. The study caused severe harm and many preventable deaths until a whistleblower exposed them in 1972. The Tuskegee study caused huge outrage, leading to major changes, starting with the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report has 3 core principles: autonomy, or the freedom to make choices; beneficence, or maximizing benefits while minimizing risks; and finally, justice, which means you shouldn't be unfair. Your participants are the people who will benefit from the study. The Tuskegee study also led to the creation of the OHRP, which enforces the rule that every institution must have an IRB. Consent means permission. It must be given freely, and the participant must understand what they're agreeing to. There are 3 types of consent. The first type is implied consent. The person doesn't say, "I agree," but they do something that tells us they agree. For example, if you go to a patient and tell him, "I will now listen to your heartbeat," and the patient removes his shirt, this action implies that the person consents. This isn't allowed for all types of research, especially when there's risk, like in controlled trials. This is only for low-risk studies like anonymous surveys. The second type is expressed or explicit consent. The participant here states clearly that they consent. It's either signed or recorded. The third type is informed consent, which is the stronger version of expressed consent. There are four components of an ethically valid informed consent. First, disclosure. You basically tell the patient everything they need to know before they decide. Second, understanding. You can tell someone everything, but if they don't understand it, there's no point. Your job is to ensure the participant truly understands what you're giving them. Third, voluntariness. The choice of your participant must be free. There shouldn't be pressure, manipulation, threats, etc. Fourth, competence. Not only the participant must be competent, but also the researcher must be competent. That's why we students have a CBR supervisor. The lecture also mentions 14 elements of an informed consent form, so let's go over them quickly. 1. Describe the overall purpose. There shouldn't be claims of effectiveness, meaning you cannot say, this drug will cure your disease. Instead, you say, the study will test whether the drug works better. 2. Expected duration of participation. 3. Description of procedures that will be followed. Explain what placebo and randomization means. Your participant should not be surprised. 4. Describe the risks and harms. You don't have to mention the risks that are wildly unlikely, like an asteroid might hit the building, but you should tell them about risks that are realistic and foreseeable. 5. Describe benefits the participant may expect. Even if the study doesn't directly help the participant through things like health checkups and whatnot, there is still benefit to the community by contributing knowledge. 6 and 7. Describe the alternatives to participating and explain the full range of alternative options. For example, if your study is about an experimental drug for hypertension, the alternatives include ACE inhibitor, lifestyle changes, or no treatment. 8 and 9. Confidentiality of records and who will have access. 10. Compensation in case of injury or failure of treatment. Explain if compensation is available, what it consists of, whom to contact, etc. 11 and 12. Tell your participant about who to contact for questions about research and who to contact for questions about the rights of participants. 13 and 14. Voluntary participation and the right to withdraw. The participant must know that they have a right to say, I want to stop, and that this will not hurt them. They should also know that if a study is anonymous, they will not be able to withdraw after they submit their answers, as there is no way to find their data and remove it. Lastly, we'll be going over some short topics mentioned in the lecture. Earlier, we talked about competence, but what about psychiatric patients? Most research requires informed consent from the participants themselves. But if you exclude psychiatric patients who cannot consent, you will never learn how to treat those patients. You cannot develop better treatments for schizophrenia if you only test those drugs on healthy people. This is where surrogate informed consent comes into place. A surrogate is someone who stands in for another person. A legally authorized representative, like a parent for example, gives permission instead of the patient. There's also criteria for using psychiatric patients in clinical trials. First, the risk is not more than minimum risk. You cannot expose them to high risks unless there's direct benefit to them. Second, the research cannot be carried out with competent individuals. If you can use healthy volunteers instead, then you should not use psychiatric patients. Now, what about children? Children cannot give legal informed consent because they lack the decision-making capacity. The solution to this problem is a two-part system. There must be consent from a parent or legal guardian, and there must be assent from the child. Assent is basically the child's agreement to participate. Even if the parents agree, if the child doesn't agree, then we don't include them in our research. For older children, like 9 to 18, you can give them a written assent form, but it should be at their level. The form you give a third grader is not the same as you give to the senior in high school. If the child is very young so that they cannot read, you can ask them verbally. Now, someone might ask, Khalifa, can I use deception in my research? An example of deception in research would be telling participants there's other people in a room when there's actually just a recording of voices. Generally, deception is not allowed. It violates the first component of informed consent, where you have to disclose what you're doing. Deception can also potentially harm the participant, not necessarily physically, but it could be social or psychological. There are some situations where deception is allowed, like when the study cannot be done without deception. The Hawthorne effect is a phenomenon where people change their behavior because they know they are being watched. If you are studying how people, for example, naturally behave in a room, if you tell them you are watching them, they will act differently. So here, you can use deception by first observing them, and then later going to them and telling them they were part of a study and taking their permission to use their data. The last thing we'll go over is the concept of equipoise. Imagine you are trying to know whether this new drug is better than the standard drug. You think the new drug might be better, but you don't know for sure. Isn't it a problem if you randomly assign patients to either the old or the new drug? Wouldn't this violate your duty as a doctor to do what's best for each patient? The answer is that you can only do this type of study if you are genuinely uncertain which drug is better. This genuine uncertainty is what we call equipoise. Without equipoise, you cannot do randomized controlled trials. If you already know which treatment is better, you should just give them the better treatment. There should be a chance this new treatment is better or not better. You genuinely don't know. Equipoise is not just for the researcher. The participants must understand there's uncertainty. And it's also not just one person's opinion, it's about the medical community. Equipoise is also why we cannot use placebo as a control when there's a proven effective therapy that exists. For example, if you are testing a new antibiotic for pneumonia, your control group should not take a placebo because there is already a drug for pneumonia. This would violate equipoise because you know for sure the standard treatment is better than placebo. What you do here is you give your control group standard antibiotic instead of a sugar pill placebo. Placebo is only given if you don't know if the new treatment is better than nothing, since placebo is basically nothing. Equipoise is also temporary. As we have more and more data, we may see that one drug is clearly better than the other. Here, equipoise no longer exists, and we must stop the study early. With that being said, I hope you've benefited from this video. If there's something you don't understand or have any questions, feel free to reach out. Good luck.